All right, we're starting to get some people in. I want to welcome everyone for our presentation today. As you know, it's 10 proven podcast growth strategies. So these are going to be practical tips and strategic insights for audience development. With every podcast, it's a little bit different, and every podcast is going to have a little bit different of a growth strategy, just depending on their goals, depending on the type of show, depending on the resources you have, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of more generic. So if you were to do an audit with us, it would be a lot more specific to your needs and to your show and to your subject matter, et cetera. But these are some things that kind of everybody can take a look at and help them develop their own custom strategy. But again, these are kind of like generic things that everyone should at least know about. So I'm excited to get started. I want to let everybody know that throughout the presentation, Manny, who's on our team, will be in the chat, adding in some context, some extra tips and insights that will be also linking to any like apps or resources that I recommend. So keep an eye out for that. At the end, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A. So you can put your questions in the Q&A now and I'll answer them. Either Manny will answer them in the chat or I'll answer them at the end. And so we're going to do about 30 minutes here and then the Q&A chat afterwards. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction of myself, just so you know who I am. So I've been at the podcast consultant since about 2019. Previous to that, I was freelancing as a podcast producer and an editor, which I still do. Um, I like to say that I have an artistic sensibility when it comes to audio. I'm a real audio nerd and a geek, and I think there is an art and a science to both. I've produced tons of shows, probably 1,000 episodes or so over my entire career. But I've gotten a lot of coverage in the media. I've gotten some nice write-ups in the New York Times and Forbes for shows that I've produced. I'm also just a regular contributor to a lot of the shows on TPC. Some of the longest running, most successful ones. I started off as an editor. Um, and then in my capacity as the launch and audit specialist, which is what I am now, where I help develop and audit shows. I've developed shows most recently for big organizations like Franklin Templeton and Columbia Business School through my work here at TPC. So in my time as the launch and audit specialist, I've encountered a lot of different like growth strategies and tips, and a lot of what I talk about in both my launch operations and my audit operations is the things that we're going to talk about today. Like I said, a little bit more generic here than we would if you were to actually do an audit with us. But again, it's a great place to start and just some good tips and insights in general for everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get into the agenda and then we'll get started. So once again, these are 10 steps. These aren't like the 10 steps. These are like 10 steps that are proven strategies that will help you with your growth and help you, again, like I said, create your own custom growth strategy. Some of these may or may not apply to you. They may apply to you differently. I try my best to make this as general as possible and as helpful as possible. But basically, we'll talk about 10 different things today in brief. There will be more insights that we can share afterwards. And of course, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A at the end. So we're going to start off with just increasing episode frequency, super important thing. Enhancing social media presence and frequency, also important. A big one is optimize your show notes, your titles, and the cover art. So we'll be doing a lot of talking about that today. Leveraging email marketing, or starting to do that if you haven't yet. Optimizing web presence. We'll talk a little about websites and why that's important. We're going to talk a little bit about calls to action and implementing them consistently. We'll talk briefly about guest appearance strategies, both having guests on your show as well as being a guest to promote your own show. And then a couple of the final things are so leveraging the podcast apps, like having ownership over your show on the specific podcast apps, Spotify and Apple being the biggest ones. So we're going to talk a little about leveraging Spotify for podcasters and then optimizing your show for Apple Podcasts using their platform, which is called Apple Podcast Connect. And then finally, we're going to talk about just developing a regular analytics review and a meeting and kind of like making sure that that's something you're consistently keeping an eye on and how to do that. But then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. Like I said, you can go to the Q&A and leave your comments now. If it's something easy that Manny can answer, he'll do so via text there. Otherwise, at the end, I will read your questions and give you my opinion live. All right, so let's get started. So episode frequency. Um, Streamlining production for consistent content. So you may or may not need to streamline your production, and you may not need to increase your episode frequency, but it's something that we see very often in our launches and audits is that people are inconsistent with how they're putting out their episodes. Um, we typically tell people to aim for at least 2 to 4 episodes a month, because that just seems like it's pretty much doable for most people, depending on their situation. Um, this could mean changing your format. It could mean making your production a little bit easier by outsourcing it. There are some people who will pre-record full seasons, so they'll have like 12 episodes per season, and then they'll have all those banked and ready to go. Um, and then you will have your second season that you can work on while that's happening. That doesn't work for everybody. A lot of shows that are more centered around like a specific topic or something, they would cover that in season one and then go on to season two. But that's something that you may consider if you're having a hard time keeping up with a weekly show. Um, Occasionally, people will need to simplify their format in order to do this. So, for example, in one of our audits recently, we had a show that had 3 hosts, and they often have on 2 experts. So that's 2 guests and 3 hosts. Um, the editing becomes really complicated and time consuming when you have that. The scheduling becomes even more complicated and time consuming when you do that. So our suggestion for them was to have each host do a solo episode occasionally. So you kind of like split up the work of creating this additional bonus content. But they found that it was really effective because they were able to take the host's unique perspective and expertise and give that as a value add to the podcast while increasing the frequency. Um, Sometimes that just is a matter of shortening the episode length too. A lot of people will put out, weekly or bi-weekly, a 3 hour episode or a 2.5 hour episode, 90 minutes and above. In that case, what you might want to do is split those up into part ones and part twos. And mainly the reason why you want to increase episode frequency is because, for one thing, listeners will develop like a habit of listening to, say, every Wednesday you drop an episode, and every Wednesday people start to realize like, oh, on my way to work, on my morning commute, I can listen to this podcast. And then they develop habits around it. And then the habit leads to regular listenership. And then once you have that regular listenership, you can communicate to your dedicated fans, like, here's how you sign up for our weekly newsletter. Here's how you sign up for our social media, to kind of like expand that reach with them. Um, Also, algorithmically, it benefits you because when you go on Spotify and you see there's a tab on the podcast that says more like this, and it will recommend more shows. In Apple, it does a similar thing. If you're wanting to find like a similar show, it will recommend them for you. And they basically are recommending that based on amount of episodes and then amount of reviews and amount of listeners. So increasing your uh, episode frequency will benefit you there over the long run. We'll talk about some more ways to kind of use that to your advantage as well. So, again, if you have any questions on any of these, I will follow up via email. If you can't get it today, Manny can do it in the chat, or ask questions at the end. So very much related to that, keeping up a cadence with your podcast is also enhancing your social media presence, maximizing engagement across platforms. Um, so similar to the way that it's algorithmically beneficial to you in the podcast platforms, the same goes for social media, and probably even more. Some of you who are familiar with like Instagram, you may see like that in the Discover tab, there's always constantly new things accounts that you're not following, etc., that you're being shown. So you want to maximize your engagement in order to have more visibility on social media in general. So I'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Um, One thing to note is that in social media in general, what's most engaging, what gets the most comments, what gets the most shares, what gets the most likes, etc., is actually video, and video specifically of people talking. So how that's beneficial for how the podcast market is currently, post-pandemic, everybody's using Zoom, and then that became kind of like the standard for podcasts, if not Zoom, Riverside, StreamYard, etc. Um, Not everybody actually utilizes the video element that they have from their podcasts. A lot of people are still recording on Zoom, but then just taking the audio. But you really have an advantage in the fact that you do have a video version that you can share clips from. And that's one of the most engaging things that you can do on social media with podcasts. There are a number of ways to do that are a little bit easier than like taking timestamps and going and editing everything yourself. And Manny will share in the comments a few links to different apps that will help with this. There's a lot of AI stuff out there that can kind of at least get you started. Now, to be honest, anytime I recommend any AI thing, it's because it's basically a prosumer product where someone who's not necessarily a professional editor can at least get something decent going as far as video clips. But it's never really going to be as good as like a professional video editor or professional audio editor. So just keep that in mind as you're like navigating some of these apps. But for the people who can't quite afford to hire somebody or pay for services, a lot of these apps are a really good way to get started. One of those for video clips would be Headliner. Headliner has a program called Eddie, where basically you can upload your video and then it will transcribe it with AI and then select clips that might make good content. And you can edit those a little bit and change it to your liking. It's a really nice way to format everything properly. So you can get it on Twitter, you can get it on YouTube, you can get it on Instagram Reels, you can get it on YouTube Shorts, and it'll be in the right format. So just like I was saying about the cadence, you really want to do at least weekly on social media, ideally more frequently. But what you should at least do is establish a schedule so that the podcast comes out every Wednesday. So every Wednesday we're going to post one clip, and then every Friday we're going to post a second clip. That'll just like keep you to a regular and consistent schedule. And like I said, the platforms will like recommend you more the more that you're posting, the more followers you get, the more engagement that you get, etc. um, don't be afraid to go back into your archive. So if you haven't actually done a lot of like posting on your previous episodes, there's no reason that you can't go back and get clips that are evergreen. Obviously, if there's like shows that are talking about specific news, things that are in the headlines, you don't always want to use those, but typically in every episode, you can find something that's a little bit evergreen. So that's one way to create like a bank of having social media clips ready to go, so that you can get it scheduled and just have that consistency. Um, there are other than Canva, there's also like Descript, there's Opus Clips, there's Peach, there's a bunch of things that will now help you create video content very easily. Um, you probably want to be familiarizing yourself with Canva too. Canva is a really good tool that's similar to like Adobe Illustrator, but it's more, again, I'm going to keep using this term prosumer, which is like a consumer who's like, trying to do things as a professional. And Canva will really help you get there. There's plenty of templates and stuff that make things really easy. And we'll talk about down the line how to make things in Canva and how to utilize that better. Um, yeah, so we'll actually be talking about that next, because the next thing we're talking about is how to optimize your show notes, your title, and your cover art. So that's to boost discoverability and appeal. Um, so the name of the podcast, the podcast show notes, um, are all things that can be searched basically. So they add to your SEO. So you should really think about naming podcasts strategically. What I usually tell people when it comes to naming, not just your shows, but also your episode titles is you kind of think about it like what would be an answer to a question that somebody would Google, right? So if you have a show that's about um, like personal finance and, financial security and stuff, you'd want to name an episode like how to achieve financial security quickly. Something that will trigger um, the algorithms to like to show your podcast episode or your podcast in general. The same thing goes for show notes. Information that you put in there will be available in search engines. The other benefit to having SEO friendly keywords and text in your show notes is that, for example, on Spotify, if you go to somebody's show page and they want to find something about a specific topic, they can actually search um, the podcast specifically, and it will show results based on what's in your show notes. So people can find like the specific content they want in your podcast. But if you're not doing show notes, they won't necessarily find that and know that you did an episode about it. Um, there are a lot of SEO tools out there that you can try out, and Manny will put some of those in the chat. There are things like TubeBuddy or vidIQ that basically will take your episode and they will make a transcript from that, and then they will use um, that transcript to pick out like keywords that would be helpful as far as search engines. Um, these are fairly new technologies. They're kind of in beta still. Um, again, if you go to a professional podcast service provider like us, like we do show note optimization where we format and write everything out for you with a human brain, which is only slightly better than AI sometimes, but um, it it's just really important that you have like enough information in the show notes that people can find what they're looking for. If you are providing what they're looking for, you want to make sure that you're making it easy to find as possible. Um, those TubeBuddy and vidIQ will help you like game that system a little bit, or at least let you learn about how the algorithm works. Um, so let's see, thumbnails and cover art. These are super, super important, especially on YouTube. And I won't get into it too much because basically thumbnail art on YouTube is a whole nother world. But I will say that it's one of the most important things, and it's what makes people actually click on your video to watch it. Um, Same thing goes in podcast platforms to less of a degree, but what I always recommend people do, and this is again where Canva can come into play, is to create episodic cover art. So like for every episode you put out, either you put a picture of the guest on there, or you create some sort of like imagery that explains like what the topic is. Um, this benefits you in a lot of ways. Like it just stands out. It looks better visually. Specifically on Apple Podcasts, they will highlight shows differently based on like what the artwork looks like. So if you have episodic artwork, it's more likely that they will display it like on their recommended page with the episodic artwork versus just like the standard podcast logo. Um, the other benefit of having episodic cover art is that you can promote with it because you have a nice image that says like this is who was on the show, this is what the topic is about, and then that's also something that is nice to share with your guests because then the guest has like this nice image with their picture and the name of the podcast and everything, and they're more likely to share that way. So then you get more of their audience, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later when it comes to our guest strategy, because I think that is a really important um, way to bring in new listenership. So we'll move on to the next one. Um, so we're going to talk about leveraging email marketing. So not everybody has so some people's podcast is basically, especially with the clients we work with, is basically like an extension of their brand or an extension of their company. So they may or may not already have a newsletter set up. So you can definitely combine those, and we've seen people have a lot of success with that. But if not, if you've yet to establish one, I'll talk a little bit about how to do that and why. Um, so one of the best ways to kind of skip the algorithm is once you've found your audience and you found like your most dedicated audience, those are going to be the people who you want to sign up for your newsletter. Because that way you can basically market and promote to them directly. So every time an episode comes out, they'll get it in their email as opposed to having to find it on the podcast platform. And then you don't have to deal with any of this like algorithmic stuff that I'm talking about. It just goes directly to them. Um, so you can actually embed a podcast player in an email newsletter so that you can actually have people play the podcast in their browser, and it will, depending on how you embed it, because you can embed it from a hosting site like Captivate or Buzzsprout or whatever you might use, so that they can also actually subscribe to the podcast in their email browser. They can listen in their email browser. So it's really convenient for one thing. And those plays all go to your RSS feed. So you still um, see an increase in listenership that way, and you can still include that in all of your analytics. Um, there's also a way to very easily convert by using, again, I'm going to mention this one is Headliner's Eddy program, where you can basically upload your episode. It will create a transcript, and then from that transcript, it will give you like suggestions for a blog post or a newsletter. Um, Once again, it's AI, so you have to say that, it's probably about 85% good to go. Uh, it's not 100% like the way it would be with a hired human who you do it, or if you do it yourself. But if it's a time issue for you, it's a huge time saver. And it just very conveniently formats it, so you can just copy and paste, you're good to go. Um, you should be doing that for every episode, basically. So every time an episode comes out, you can use MailChimp or one of these other newsletter apps to schedule it. So as soon as the episode drops, an email goes out to your listenership. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how to grow that newsletter. Optimizing web presence, so creating a digital home for your podcast. So this is essentially about like creating a dedicated podcast website. Um, What we recommend to a lot of our clients, especially the launch clients, is a app called Podpage. So basically, it's similar to like a Squarespace or something, where it makes it easy to customize a website based on templates. But what's unique about Podpage is that it actually will take your RSS feed and all the information that's in your RSS feed, which includes, your show notes, the episode title, the cover art, everything, and then create a page for each episode. It will also take your logo and then make the episodes template and color match. And there's some customizable stuff in there that's very helpful. You can link your all your social media profiles, so then it'll have a feed that shows all of your latest, tweets or X's, whatever they're called now, um, right there on the screen. And then you can also incorporate a newsletter through Podpage, which is really convenient. Um, if you already have a website, like I was saying, a lot of the clients I work with have a podcast that's associated with, a organization or a company. There are ways to just embed uh, the podcast player from your hosting site into um, a new page on your website. Um, there is also a way to use Podpage by creating a custom domain and then doing a redirect link on your current website. So you can have your current website and then have a podcast page, and that'll essentially send it to the pod page. And then you don't really have to have like a web person or anybody monitoring it, because like I said, it will automatically update via your RSS feed based on how you've selected your settings in Podpage. So it's just a really convenient way to have an updated website all the time without having to put too much time or effort or money into it. I think Podpage is like $9 or $10 a month or something at this point. Um, in general, having a website is just the best SEO strategy if you can have it be whatever the podcast name is .com, that's ideal. It's just going to make your search engine optimization process just in general a lot easier. Um, and then on that website, you should make sure that you have like subscription buttons and then links to podcast platforms so that when people go on your website, they're not just isolated and this is where I listen to the podcast. You bring it into their podcast players where they listen to their music anyway, where they listen to all the other podcasts and shows. So you got to make sure that you link that. Um, One mistake that some people make too is that they won't have like a page, a dedicated page for each episode. Um, this is a SEO strategy too, because like then that specific page that will have the show notes and talking about, the specific topics and stuff, will show up higher in SEO than it would otherwise if it was just on a page with a playlist with all of the podcasts with like no text about the show. So that's really important too when you're thinking about making a website. Um, like I said, there are other podcast creation websites like Squarespace and stuff like that, but they still require like a little bit more of a setup and a little bit more time and effort. And Podpage is probably like the best way that we found, and we've had a lot of clients that have had success with that. So Manny will be linking you with a couple of those options as well. Um, but overall, just it's really important that you have some kind of website. Some people they will just use like a beacons or like a link tree type of thing, which is basically just a place where all of the links to all your various social media accounts and podcast platforms work. If you have a good enough landing page and it looks nice enough, that's probably fine. Um, but in general, it's better to have a actual like real looking website that people can play the podcast from and subscribe and find all your other links. So all right, moving on to number 6. So this is about implementing consistent calls to action. So encouraging listener engagement. Basically, what do you want people to do after they've listened to the podcast? So um, what a lot of people do is they record what's called a static outro. So like they would record a short clip of audio that goes at the end of the podcast that just says, hey, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast and make sure you follow us on social media. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter. Make sure you go to our website, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that you want to put it at the end is you don't want to have too much stuff up front. And people who listen all the way to the end are generally going to be your most dedicated listeners. And you have a little bit more space at that point to do the call to action. Um, the basics, you really want to make sure that people are subscribed to the podcast so that it pops up on their new episode feed. You want to make sure that they rate and review the podcast. So Spotify's rating system and then Apple's review and rating system are really important because, like I said before, the more ratings and reviews you get, the more algorithmic benefit you get from that. And in general, when people are, say, asked to be a guest on a podcast and they want to see, like, oh, how big of a show is this? They go and look at the ratings and reviews. The more ratings and reviews you have, more means you're more likely going to have more listeners, which would make people more likely to want to come on the show. Um, so in addition to recording that little audio portion at the end, you also want to tie that in with the show notes. So in the show notes, you can have hyperlinks to all those things that you mentioned. So your website, how to sign up for your newsletter, et cetera, and just say in the audio recording, this is how you find it. So it's just a way to make sure that people can uh, be in direct contact with you outside of just listening to the show and how best to do that. And the more you do it, the more people will sign up. Eventually, they'll hear it 100 times. Eventually, they will sign up. All right, so moving on. Guest appearance strategy. So expanding your reach through collaboration. So this goes both ways. When you're thinking about inviting guests on, you want to be strategic about it and thinking about what their followers are, what their audience is, and what they bring to the table, and book based off of that. Because anytime you book a guest, you want to get as much of their audience and listenership over to listening to your podcast. Um, The other thing that you should consider when you're inviting guests, specifically guests who have their own podcasts, is crossover opportunities. So you can invite somebody on your show that has a podcast and basically do uh, one recording, but you can reach two audiences because you can arrange so that your recording and interview will be on the guest podcast and vice versa. Um, the other thing that you can do is what's called a feed drop. So this is something that's typically something that you would pay for, and you would usually negotiate this with a podcast where essentially you can come up with a trailer or a short piece of audio that explains like what the your podcast is, and then have that air on someone else's podcast feed. The best place to find podcast listeners is on podcast apps. So when you do those feed drops, you basically access a whole entire audience of someone else's show, and then makes it really convenient for them to just click over and feed your show. Um, the other thing would be ad swaps with other shows. So instead of like paying for advertising, you can take someone's ad and put it on your show and, swap vice versa. So those are really common things that we've seen um, be successful. And then finally creating a pitch packet, which is essentially just having a place where everything that a podcast would need to book a guest is there. So you want to have your picture, like ideally a headshot that they can use. You're gonna have a bio, you're gonna have all your links, and then ideally like a bullet pointed list of like these are the topics that I have expertise in that we could potentially talk about. And then ideally, if you can have that as like a Google Drive or something that you can just send to them easily, and then have some sort of a calendar, like a Calendly thing is something that I use a lot, which is like, okay, you make it easier to book because, I'm available every Sunday and Wednesday, and here's my Calendly link so they can sign up right away, and you don't have to have a lot of back and forth. I found that that's a really effective way to get booked too, just because it's easy. You don't have to go through all the technical stuff of scheduling. Um, cool. So we're gonna move on to leveraging Spotify for podcasters, utilizing platform specific features. So there's video integration on Spotify. So if you're filming and releasing video episodes, you can actually have them streaming on Spotify, which is unique to them. Apple doesn't do that. They've just introduced commenting. So basically, people can comment on your episodes the same way they would social media. So just further engagement. You can do polls in your show notes now. You can highlight specific episodes. So you can put a particularly good episode at the top of your feed. So that says basically start here. Um, Spotify also has specific demographics. So like gender and age is not something that most analytics will give you, but Spotify will. If you're not using Spotify as your specific hosting platform, you should keep in mind that those are just demographics for the people who listen on Spotify, not Apple and not everywhere else. But either way, it is very helpful, especially if you're considering advertising or you're trying to reach a specific demographic. Kind of same thing goes for Apple's version of Spotify for podcasters, which is called Apple Podcast Connect. Um, so it's basically about maximizing your visibility on what is probably the biggest platform. It's like 50% of the time it's Apple, 50% of the time it's Spotify as far as where people get their shows. So make sure that you sign up there. With both of these platforms, you don't have to have your hosting site originate from there. So like if you sign up with Buzzsprout or Captivate or whatever it might be, you basically just import your RSS feed to Apple or Spotify and then create user accounts there. And then you have access to all of their features. So Apple has very similar features as Spotify does. They have really good analytics as well. You you want to make sure that you validate your show and that you're actually the owner of the show there. And that's a pretty simple process where you just give them your RSS feed, and then whatever email is associated with your RSS feed, it will send them email. Next thing you know, you have control over your Apple show. And you can use some of those platform specific features that I was talking about. Um, and they're basically the same thing as Spotify, except it's Apple's version of it. Um, And then finally, regular analytics reviews. So data-driven growth strategies. So you want to get as much data as you possibly can to make the best decisions possible. In order to do that, you actually have to pay attention to what's going on. You also have to know a little bit about the terms, and I think Manny will share one of our recent articles from the TPC blog, which has a lot of great tips. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today, we have like full articles about. So make sure that you check that out. But basically, it's just having regular team meetings, setting goals, focusing on key metrics. And what a lot of people do is they create their own spreadsheets. So they come up with their goals, they come up with the metrics that they care about, and then they keep track of everything themselves. So the reason that you would do this is because podcast analytics aren't really super standardized, and on different platforms, they use different language, downloads versus streams versus plays, etc. And again, in this article that Manny is linking from our blog, we'll kind of break all that down for you. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But essentially, it's just about the same way it is for analytics and data on anything else. The more attention you pay, the more insights you'll have, and the better your strategy will be once it's based off of that. Um, so that's essentially it. Those are like 10 of the most basic, kind of like general things that everyone should know a little bit about. Um, and so, yeah, I'm excited to answer any questions. And once again, I will just encourage you guys to check out our website with all of our different blogs that will talk more specifically and detailed about a lot of things I'm talking about here. All right, so I've gone a little bit over, but we're going to open it up for Q&A here. So let's see what we got. And if for whatever reason your questions don't get answered, um, feel free to follow up with us. And let me get on here, the final slide actually, because you can go to thepodcastconsultant.com/newsletter, basically. All right. Gonna open up the Q&A here. Bear with me. All right, so it looks like we do have some questions that have been answered. We got a lot to get through here. So David has a question here. How important do you think having video versions of your show is? I've tried adding audio-only episodes to YouTube, but got very little traction there. But video requires a lot more effort. That's a great question. We actually just did a webinar a couple months back about converting your show from video to audio. Um, I would say that if you're taking the time to upload on video or upload video to YouTube, it should be a video. What you can do is use Headliner, which is another program linked, which will basically take your audio version and create a moving image, like an audiogram. So basically, it would be the cover art, and then it would show like a little wave motion. So at least there's some sort of video. And you can actually set that up to your YouTube channel, so it automatically uploads to YouTube as soon as you upload your podcast to the RSS feed. So when it goes out to Spotify and iTunes and everything, it will automatically upload a audiogram to your YouTube channel, and it will use the show notes to fill out the description field in YouTube. So that's one way that you can get started. But yeah, in general, you're not going to get a lot of traction that way, just because people tune into YouTube because they want to watch things that are visual. So if you want to get a presence, that's an easy way to do it, but you should probably consider, hiring an outside video editor or utilizing some of these other apps that make video editing a little bit easier, like Descript or Headliner, those kind of things. Um, let's see. Christy has a question. Do you change the title for the YouTube thumbnail and title for more engagement? Um, So, like I was saying, there's a lot of considerations about YouTube thumbnails. I think what you're asking is whether or not you uh, change it over time, because like a thing that a lot of YouTube people have been doing lately is they'll put out a video that has a thumbnail, cover art, and then for a few weeks it does that, and then they kind of change what it is to reflect like another topic used in that's been talked about in the episode. Um, I think if you're asking about that, that's what I would say. But if you're saying should it be different from podcast and YouTube, I would say yes, because basically, and there are articles about this that will link, but basically, like in YouTube, you have to have it like really bold and uh basically like having giant letters, the topic, and like, very upfront big artwork where it's a little bit different. So I would say, yeah, don't be afraid to experiment on YouTube and using different thumbnails than you would with your uh podcast thumbnails, because they are different and they're sized differently. So like what's on there has to be different as well. So I hope that helps. Feel free to follow up. Tyler has a question here. Our company has had an established newsletter, but is it worthwhile to create a separate newsletter specifically for the podcast? So this is a question that we get a lot about how to integrate your company with the podcast. So some people will have separate social media accounts. Some people will just use the same social media account. It really depends kind of specifically on the topics that you're talking about and whether it's relevant or not to your company. So like if you have, you know, a finance business and their podcast is about sports, like it's not going to make any sense, obviously. I would say the infrastructure of your newsletter and the amount of people you have on your newsletter is uh it's very important, and that's a big part of what your decision might be. I know for me, when I've signed up for podcasts, and I've helped some launch clients do this as well, is that when you go to like the main website and you're signing up for a newsletter, ostensibly for your company or whatever it might be, you can have an option come up that says, I want to hear newsletters about the podcast as well. And you can have that be an option. So that way you don't feel like you're imposing on people who sign up for a different reason. So that would be one way to handle it. Um, but there's no right answer for everybody. It kind of just depends. But I would definitely say that it benefits you if you already have that infrastructure, and especially the valuable recipients of the newsletter. If you already have those in place, that's great. Um, let's see. We have a question here from Rose. I moved podcast from Spotify to Acast. The hyperlinks on Spotify don't work now. Some do and some don't. Any suggestions? Okay, so this is a recurring issue. Basically because they're not standardized. Um, Podcasts like hyperlinks will show up some places and not. I've found in general that like the free podcast hosts don't really do a great job of like integrating hyperlinks. So you might want to try using something like Captivate is a really good one. Um, a lot of times if your hyperlinks don't work because you have a link that says like click here and then here is the hyperlink, that sometimes won't work on certain platforms. And what you want to actually do is write out, www.mypodcast.com rather than using, and then hyperlink that as well. Usually that will help get around, but not always. All right, we got a few more questions here. Um, does episode length matter or is content king? It's a question from Jason. Uh, Content definitely is king. There are considerations to make. I think one of the things that's important about doing data analysis is that you can actually see it, depending on what platforms you're using and what analysis you're using. You can actually see on Apple Podcasts, for example, which is why you should sign up for their Apple for Podcasters. You can see the percentage that people listen to of every episode and average that. So if you're putting out 2 hour long episodes and you see that, you know, people only usually listen to about the 50-minute mark, then, that'll give you your answer. So I would just say pay very close attention to your analytics when you're doing episode length. In general, I try to say that you should keep everything between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. There are a lot more trends towards shorter episodes lately. So if you have a 10 to 20-minute episode, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, it's just like a matter of like surveying your audience and looking at the analytics and seeing what actually works for you, because it's different for every show, depending on the topics that you're covering. Let's see. This is coming from David. Any idea how to remove a duplicate listing on Spotify if a show has ended up with two listings? Okay, so this is a common mistake that people make if they are on their hosting site and they submit to Spotify and then they go to Spotify to get the Spotify for Podcasters count, but they actually add a new podcast to Spotify. Usually, if you need to resolve that, if you have a Spotify for Podcasters account, you can just tell them on their customer service, like, hey, this is what happened. I have a duplicate podcast. And they're actually pretty responsive. They have a chat too. So I would just say reach out to customer service. They should be able to take care of that for you. Let me see. What else do we got? We have a lot of questions. I don't want to miss anybody, but I just want to make sure, be mindful of our time here. Um, let's see. All right, this one's from Rachel. What is the best way to handle guests who do not follow through with posting your episodes together or sharing with their audience in any way? Uh, this is our policy for all guests, but some don't follow through. So there's not a whole lot you can do about that. It kind of depends at the time of booking. And one thing I tell people to put in their pitch packets when they're trying to get on a show is say that you are very willing to promote. Um, you should be really communicative about it upfront when you're booking guests, like, hey, this is kind of what we expect of our guests. But the other thing I've seen people do that is effective, because this is a really common problem, is to basically put together a package for your guests that has a little bit of a caption example that they can use on social media that just says like, hey, I was a guest on blah blah blah, blah podcast and we had a great conversation about blah blah blah, and then give them the link, give them the cover art, give them the clips on a Google Drive. Because that just makes it a lot easier for them to share. And the better the clips look, the better the images look, the better the caption is, the more likely they will be able to share it. So I would say that's one way to do it. Obviously, you want to make sure that you tag them on all their social media accounts. If you can on Instagram, do collaborative posts with them. They will get a notification that says so and so podcast wants to collaborate with you. And then it'll actually end up on both feeds, the feed of the guest as well as the feed of the podcast. So that's what I'd say. But don't feel bad because it's a very common issue that basically everybody has. So, but I hope that helps give you some insight. Um, let's see. I have some multiple question askers, which is fine. I'll try to get to all. Any suggestions on how to initially build your newsletter email list? Are there any good ways to find existing lists? And that's from David. Um, I'm not sure. I mean, I wouldn't say that you want to just find as many people as you can. I would say that you want to find people that are actually going to engage. And really the best way to do that is to just talk about it on the podcast and explain like what benefit people will get from the newsletter. A lot of times people will do like a little contest or something like, if you sign up for a newsletter, you get a free t-shirt of the podcast, etc. So like incentivizing it like that is one way to do it. But honestly, the best way to build it, the same thing for podcasts is just to build it naturally with like a base of people who really care. So it just hitting it every day, putting it in your CTA. So every day people hear about this newsletter. You might also want to bring some of the subject matter that's in the newsletter into the podcast. So you could say like, just to let you know, our newsletter went out this week. It's about this, this, and this. So we're going to talk a little bit about it on the show today. If you'd like to hear more, make sure you sign up for our newsletter. But there's really no easy way to get there. Let's see. David's got one more question. Does Podpage have support for networks or channels? That's a good question. Um, I'm not 100% sure. So I would imagine what you would have to do is create a separate pod page for each, but then try to unify them somehow on another website or a link. As far as I know, they don't have any network support because the entire page is based off your RSS feed. And there would be multiple RSS feeds. There wouldn't be an easy solution for that. So I would reach out to their customer service and ask, but as far as I know, there isn't a great way to do that, and you'd have to establish um, a separate page for each show on the network. So, but it might be worth reaching out to them, asking their customer service. Okay, one final question here from Rose. Also, moving podcasts messed up my Apple and Apple Analytics. Any thoughts? Um, the, There is definitely a right and a wrong way to do when you're moving your podcast. So like when you're moving from one RSS feed to the other, so much stuff in the podcast industry is based off your RSS feed. Um, I mean, once it's already been done, you kind of just have to like reach out to Apple customer service or your hosting site's customer service and try to sort through it. I mean, typically you can do what's called a 301 direct, where basically your old RSS feed will direct to the new one so that there's no issues there. I mean, I'd have to hear more about your specific situation, but typically you would have to reach out to the customer service of either your hosting site, the former one, or the newer one, and then like the bigger hosting platforms like Spotify and Apple, because most other smaller apps like are aggregates that take their info from there. So it sounds like since you're already in that situation, you would just have to reach out to customer service. But typically, if you're moving your RSS feed to a new RSS feed, you might want to check in with your Spotify for podcasters, Apple Podcasts for best tips to make sure that nothing happens. Because honestly, like nothing is standardized in the industry as far as like podcast platforms and RSS feeds, and stuff does get messed up when you move around platforms too much. So I'm sorry you're there. I hope I could help you more, but okay, I got looks like maybe just one final question here. This is from Rachel. For a daily show, do you still recommend an email to your list every day, or is that overkill? Would be best practice to be daily or weekly? I would say in that case, it probably would be weekly because at least for me, if I get a podcast newsletter daily, I'm probably not going to read it every day. So in that case, I would say like bi-weekly even might be a good sell. And then you can just link to a playlist basically. Like on Spotify, you could go make a playlist and like here's this week's episodes, and it's like a way for them to get caught up on the episodes throughout the week. But yeah, I would say daily is probably like a little bit of an overkill, at least for me personally. I Unless I'm really into it, I don't think I would read a newsletter every single day. And then you want to be careful that you're giving a lot of value to, and people don't feel like you're spamming them, you know. So yeah, okay. I think that's all of the questions we have. Um, so yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Just to let everybody know, when you end here, you will see a screen on your browser that has a survey. So if you want, you can fill that out, give us some information. I encourage you to check out our website, check out our blog posts, sign up for our newsletter, because a lot of the information I'm talking about here, we go into in depth there, and I think it's very helpful. So once again, thanks everybody for joining us. It was a pleasure, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Thanks again. Oh, also want to say that this entire recording will be posted on YouTube probably within the next week. So if you missed anything, you'll have a chance to watch again. So yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate you joining us.